Today on UVA Legends podcast, I have my old pal, Lauren Alexander Augustine, who is the executive director of the Gulf Research Project. Her job is to give away $500 million to make sure the Gulf disaster, the BP Gulf disaster, doesn't happen again. Lauren, did I get that right?
Pretty much. Yep.
Okay. Well, you'll correct me while I interview you. First of all, thanks for doing this. Great to see you.
Likewise, thanks for asking me. I think that the term legend is a little bit of an oversell, but I'm really pleased to be here.
So I've been following you on LinkedIn. If you're not a legend, I don't know who is. So,
wow.
but let me give you your background. I remember you're from upstate New York, but where'd you go to high school, and what year was that?
So, okay, you want to know how old I am? Is that what we're
Oh
trying to
no, just where'd you go to high school? Yeah.
I'm just kidding. I am from outside of Rochester, New York, in a really small town called Pittsford. And so that's like, for those of you who don't know New York State, it's about 6 hours north and west of New York City. So as far from New York City as you can be, and still in the state. And I was the class of 91, but at UVA, but because I did engineering and I double majored, I came out in 92. I was on the very famous 5-year plan at the engineering school. So, yeah, so that's
okay.
it.
And I'm sure that small town was lots of Black women scientists from that small town. You mentioned UVA, you were a double major, applied math and systems engineering. You also got a master's in environmental planning from UVA. Then you went to Harvard eventually, and you got a PhD in environmental sciences. Right. Amazing. You worked for the government for a few years. You were a policy analyst for Department of Interior, I believe. And then you were an ecologist for the U.S. Geological Survey. From 2008 to present, you've worked for the National Academy of Sciences. And as I mentioned before, your focus now is the Gulf Research Project, but you've done some other fascinating things, working in Africa. I know you're on the World Economic Forum, involved in some of the work there. Lauren, did I get most of that correct?
Yeah. The one thing I would say is I've actually been at the National Academy of Sciences in 2002.
Oh, wow.
So I came here right after my postdoc at the U.S. Geological Survey. And, I've done a lot of different things here. So it's easy to kind of not be able to follow that quite so cleanly. But yeah, I actually started here in 2002.
Wow. So you were probably only 20 years old then. So
yeah,
what exactly is the National Academy of Sciences?
Oh, that's a good question. So first thing I like to remind people is that it is not the federal government. It sounds like the federal government. It's positioned here in DC, but we are actually a private nonprofit. And we were founded, I love this story, but we were founded by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, because during the Battle of Wilmington, the Union's compasses did not work on the lead hull ships. And so they couldn't get their bearings, and the Union was losing. So President Lincoln was like, someone figure out how to get this compass to work on that ship. And in that request was born the National Academy of Sciences. So we were chartered by Lincoln to provide scientific advice to the nation.
So I was going through the background of the Academy. It seems like it has full-time employees, but it also has folks that are like directors or just maybe experts that work part-time. Is that correct? Or is it mostly full-time employees?
It's both. The biggest part of the institution is actually the honorific part of it. So there are people who are famous and they're at Stanford and UVA and University of Texas and Harvard and Yale, and they did something. They wrote the book. They found the hole in the ozone layer, and they're elected into the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Medicine, National Academy of Engineering, and they stay at their institutions. And that's about 5,000, 6,000 honorific people. Here in DC, there's about 800 professional staff. Many of us have PhDs, subject matter experts, and we are the ones who kind of draw from that scientific expertise to help answer some of the pressing questions before us. Who gets the water, the farmers or the fish? Do you move people in times of climate change? Like questions like that. It's the staff that drives that work, drawing from not just that honorific talent, but talent around the world.
Yeah. Well, I want to get back to the academy, but I want to mention briefly that you're also a politician's wife. Your husband, Malcolm Augustine, is in the state legislature in Maryland. So you're a politico by marriage. This is the political season, obviously, and I know with your work around the world, you've experienced some of the effects of climate change and other types of things that we're dealing with now. How important are the politics to your work and the climate? I mean, do we have things that we need to be worried about, or are most of the things that we worry are all do the politicians do their job? The bureaucrats that are in place do their job? Are there things that we should be worried about right now in terms of the election?
Yes. So in 2024, 70% of the world is going to vote. 70% of the world is going to elect its new leaders in this calendar year. So the politics at all levels, they kind of compound. If you think of it, they really do. They really compound. And so the simple answer is yes, it matters in a great deal because we are increasingly connected. And so what the United States does at the national scale reflects what it does at the state scale, it reflects all of that coming up. But then it's an important cog in what happens in the rest of the world. And so one of the things that I do in my spare time, I guess, is I'm a civil expert for NATO. And so NATO obviously has a military side and it also has a civil side. And so on the civil side, there's these experts that they ask for help and advice. And I'm part of that cadre. And the importance of alliances, particularly that alliance, but all alliances, has never been more important because the issues that we're facing are, if they're not universal, they're shared across many of our friends around the world. And climate, refugees, water shortages, authoritarianism, these are things that are challenges around the world that we really have the best chance of finding the best solutions if we work together. So the politics matter. If you have a leader who doesn't like to play with others, if you have a leader that wants to be an isolationist and wants to go it alone and wants to pull out a superpower, name the superpower, Brexit. France came awfully close. Germany. You can go down the list. We need them all because we have a lot of existential threats. Some are political and man-made, and some are not. So, yeah, politics matter a great deal.
Yeah. So I'm the son of two civil servants. My father worked for the General Accounting Office, and my mother was a naval secretary. Sometimes in politics, we talk about doing away with bureaucrats, doing away with the administrative state, doing away with expertise in some regard. You're not government, but do you worry that if decisions are going to be made by politicians instead of experts, people, or bureaucrats, that puts us more at risk?
It's a big undertaking to run a government. Federal, state, county, it's a big undertaking. You have a lot of constituents. You have a tax base, which is substantial, usually for the size of the government, right? So you need people in all kinds of positions to make that work. And so, yeah, you need the politicians to kind of set the course because the leader, the elected leader says, this is the new policy. We want to go in this direction. We want to be carbon neutral, or we want to do drill, baby, drill, but they set that path. And then there's a lot of important roles to make that happen. And it's a very rare person, and we all work in different places, but it's a very rare person who has all of those muscle sets to be a visionary and a tactician and a manager. And you know what I mean? Like that usually doesn't come in one person. And so you need to spread that out. So yeah, I do think that the bureaucracy is important. I think that every now and then we get reminders that maybe it's the wrong size. Maybe it's not big enough. We've seen that in some recent presidential administrations that the executive branch was not fully filled and some of the functions were not being executed as designed. And sometimes it's bloated. You know, I think back to the sequestration under President Obama, where it was a 25% cut across the federal government. So everyone buckled down and did their 25% haircut. And then we never went back. The government never went back. It was like, oh, well, that kind of hurt, but we're kind of okay. So sometimes you need these resets. And like anything else, you got to right size, and life changes, culture changes at the speed of light. So you have to be adaptable, I think. But I can't think of a scenario where you'd want it at either of those extremes, like no bureaucrats or fully bureaucratic. So I think that in that middle, you need someone who can really guide us to get the right size.
Yeah. So politics is intertwined with your work, obviously, and your husband Malcolm, I guess Representative Augustine, I should call him.
Senator Augustine. Yep.
Yeah. So what have you learned from his work? Have you learned things that make you optimistic? Has that been an education for you to kind of get the inside look at how politics at a local level, which you've talked about, actually works?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing, let me just bragging on my husband a
It's
little
okay.
bit. I mean, one of the things I've really learned through him in this process is that public servants can be extremely responsive. Prior to him getting into office, I didn't know who my state delegate was. I probably could have picked out my state senator's name if you gave me a list, but I'd have to think about it if you hadn't. You know what I mean? So that there was that. So that's my own ignorance. So I've been brought into this process. But I am amazed, like people call him all hours of every single day, and they will call like, I can't get my mother into a nursing home, or my kid is, you know, my kid got into the University of Maryland, and they're saying that she is not a naturalized, you know, American citizen and is therefore not eligible for financial aid. I mean, the calls he gets are from the most minute of like, my septic tank is flooding in my basement, to I need a new policy on getting, you know, why is it that at the University of Maryland, it prefers kids from Montgomery County and Howard County and discriminates kids against Prince George's County. So he gets the full gamut. And I'm always amazed at like how a well-placed phone call can get people at the individual level the help they need. You know what I mean? It's like he takes the call, his cell phone is like public record, and people call him all the time for help across the state. It's wild. And I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't know that was I mean, other than being married to him, I would never call my state senator because I couldn't figure out something. You know what I mean? But it's a resource that I think that everyone should really consider if and when they need help.
Yeah. So Senator Augustine is able to get the personal touch. But a lot of times we feel that what's the use to get into politics? The people on Capitol Hill, and we both live in suburban DC. The people on Capitol Hill spend most of their time raising money, voting with the majority. What can you really get done? Why would good people get into politics? So your husband's a good person, and we need good people in politics. But when he looks up at what's next, if he wants to stay in politics, is he optimistic that you can have a good effect and you can make a difference, or are you going to spend all your time raising money and just voting as you're told?
So raising money is a huge part of being in politics. Full stop. And I can't speak for him, but I think that it's true what you say, that if you're looking at like the US Congress, there are a small number of people that control the big levers of how you vote, when you vote. Like, that is true. The other piece, though, that I think drives at least my husband, I can't speak for all politicians, but drives him, is that when you're like at the state level, right, you are able to move money and you're able to provide services. And so he's been able to bring just millions and millions and millions of dollars to our district in Prince George's County, which has like these deep pockets of poverty. I mean, everyone looks at the DMV as this very wealthy area overall, and that is true. But in each of these wealthy counties, there are pockets of deep poverty, and it is not, that wealth is not equitably spread in every single county. You know what I mean? And so how do you help those that need the help? And I think that is a thread that still works at the national levels. You know what I mean? Like, I know our US Congress representative, they're very active in the community. I don't know how it works when they're in their office on the Hill, but in the community, they're there trying to move the money. It's little things in law that can really make a big difference of where resources go and what resources and help can be made available to people. So it's not all fraught. And I think that the media does a great job in sensationalizing what the political process is. I think that the best public servants spend their time in the public process at the local scale, serving the people who elected them.
After watching Malcolm, could you ever be a politician yourself?
Never. Absolutely never. Like, my husband and I are pretty opposite. So he's like reserved and he's quiet and he thinks before he speaks. And anyone who knows me, like, that's all the opposite. But I'm the one like taking names, keeping score, and like things just roll off his back. So we're a good team in that way, but you will never, ever, ever see my name on a ballot. Never.
Okay. Well, you'd be amazing. You'd have my vote. So,
Thank you.
As I was prepared for this interview, I realized the Deepwater Horizon disaster was almost 14 years ago now.
Yeah.
And it seems like it was just yesterday.
Yeah.
And it's been a very long time, and it's been out of the news. I don't think anyone even thinks about it. I had a friend who went to Tampa or somewhere for vacation, Clearwater maybe, and it didn't occur to me, I wonder if the beaches are clean yet. I mean, that was this thing that it was in the back of my mind. I didn't ask him that. Where are we? Folks you may want to just kind of remind folks exactly what happened, sum it up, but where are we? Have the beaches recovered? Has wildlife, has the water recovered? What's going on in the Gulf?
Well, the Gulf is a very complicated place. Let me start with that. But you're right that this was in 2010, 14 years ago, and the oil spill is over. Like, we capped the well. I mean, it spilled for like 87 days. So capping the well was no small feat. It was more like Apollo 13 than it was the Exxon Valdez. You know what I mean? Like, you had to go several miles underwater with the equivalent of a drinking straw and put like a piece of bubble gum in that drinking straw several miles down in salt. I mean, like, it was an engineering miracle that they were able to cap that well as fast as they did, believe it or not. So a couple of things worked well, or worked to the advantage. One was that the crude that was spilling was a pretty light crude, in contrast to what we saw in Alaska in 1989. Like all of the heavy oil on the poor animals and stuff like that. It was a lighter crude. It was warmer water. And so all of those processes helped to kind of break it up a little bit faster. And there were tar balls on the beaches. Those were cleaned up pretty speedily. I wouldn't, within a year. There are oil spills all the time in the Gulf. Every single day, there's some oil spill. There's a lot of oil production in the Gulf. So when you think about the Gulf of Mexico, you think about the United States, you think about this enormous economy. The oil and energy industry in the Gulf alone contributes trillions of dollars every year to the US GDP. So we don't hear about oil spills because we don't have spills of record, which is a good thing. We don't want that. But there are little spills all the time. And when you have a basin like the Gulf of Mexico that has that much oil under its bottom surface, there's natural seeps anyway. So oil in the sea is as much a natural process as it is, as it can be a man-made accident. So right now, the seafood in the Gulf of Mexico, seafood industry in the Gulf contributes some $50 billion a year. If anyone on this podcast eats finfish or shellfish in this country, about half of that comes out of that body of water. And almost the rest of it comes out of Alaska. So there's a lot of money in the Gulf. In the seafood industry, it was extremely important to that to come back online. Gulf shrimp and Gulf snapper, those are the big ones. Gulf oysters, they are cleared and they have been for more than a decade. So I will say, in fact, since you have me on this topic, if you are in the grocery store and you have the option of buying shrimp and you have one kind of shrimp that's like $7.99 a pound, and you have another option of shrimp that's like $29.99 a pound. The $7.99 one is from Asia. And you want to be really careful because the Asian shrimp and seafood markets that we import, for reasons I cannot figure out, but we import, they have much more lax regulations on mercury, heavy metal, and how the aquaculture is done. So you don't really want to know what the Chinese are feeding their shrimp in aquaculture. You don't want to know, and you don't want to put it in your body. And so if you have the option, spend the money and buy the wild caught Gulf shrimp. Your body will thank you. Well, end of my PSA.
What does that mean? I have to be careful if I eat some sushi from Japanese sushi, or is that?
No, okay. Japanese and their sushi grade anything is 100% reliable. Okay. 100% reliable. Wow. That you can eat with confidence. It's when you look at South Asia, Southeast Asia, and China on that shrimp, and usually it's frozen shrimp. Like that's not going to be fresh anyway.
So when you were first tasked with saving the Gulf, or at least to make sure disasters like this didn't happen again, or at least their effects were mitigated. Was this something you could get really passionate about? I mean, as a scientist, is this kind of what you've been waiting for, a high profile chance to really make a difference? Is this kind of what your whole background was about, this task?
You know, in a way, take out the high profile stuff. Like I didn't really seek the spotlight in that way, but like I'm an academician with a very checkered background. I have a little engineering, I have some math, I have some science, I have some policy. I went back to science, and engineering. I'm all this mixed up stuff and very applied, right? And so it does excite me, and it's really edifying to have a job that requires all of those skills: political skills, science skills, engineering skills, application skills, translation skills, communication skills, to apply to a region that desperately needs the help. You know, I mean, you look at Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, and you've got you have the three lowest outcomes for health, education, social inequity, that stain of slavery. I mean, it's not just the South, that's the Confederate South. And that stain of the Confederacy stays. You know, you go to, you know, name your place in those states, and there's like black and there's white, and it's very complicated. But if we think about how important this region is to the United States, we can't have this region not succeed. Let's just be very clear about that. You have $60 billion of cargo getting the steel and the grain out of the Midwest, coming through that Mississippi River every year. You cannot have that not work, right?
Yeah.
You have trillions of dollars in oil, gas, and energy. You have billions of dollars in seafood, and so on, right? Mardi Gras alone contributes $2 billion in 2 weeks to the US GDP.
Wow.
Like, you can't have this region not work. But at the same time, in the course of this interview, we will lose 4 football fields of coastal land loss off of the state of Louisiana. It's happening that fast. And so we need the area. The area is really rich and important, and it's under incredible strain. Climate change, sea level rise, relative sea level rise. You have that river coming down, but that river and all of its management of the river was always built for excess, meaning the entire Mississippi basin is engineered to manage floods. But 2 years ago, we had a drought, and now we're getting saline intrusion, meaning the salt water from the Gulf is pushing up into the river. That's creating all kinds of havoc because it's drier. So all these conditions are putting strain on this area of the country that the parts of it just can withstand it the least. And so it is a really rich, complicated, knotty, thorny problem that requires that entire range of skills from health sciences, natural sciences, physical sciences, engineering sciences, and political sciences to try to figure out the solutions. So will we solve it? Will $500 million solve it? No, it's not nearly enough money. It's not nearly enough money when you consider that Hurricane Harvey alone had $25 billion in disaster. You know what I mean? So $500 million is really not much, but if we can make a dent, if we can set a path that others can tread, the path that we help to build, I will feel very, very happy about this program.
Yeah. Well, it seems like it's extremely daunting task. And when I think about your transformation into this role, I think about as lawyers, we go to law school and we don't learn how to manage anything. We go to law school, we learn how to interpret the law, we may learn how to argue cases and all those things. So we learn how to manage people and finances as is a business part of the practice of law. It's all on the job.
Right.
Well, I would think your job is a huge management task, not necessarily for a scientist, but it's nice to have that background, but just an enormous, management role. How does a scientist go about becoming such a great manager of such a big and important role?
Well, I think that scientists, in fact, are trained well to manage projects and programs. I think that training is instilled. Like, you have to kind of design your PhD, you have to figure out a method, you have to go execute the method, you have to manage your budget because it's going to cost something, time, money, energy. You got to manage that. You got to complete it. You got to do, that project management, I think is very, I think it's built into the scientific training, especially for PhD level scientists. I think managing people is a whole different thing. And so, I think it's a mix, and learning how to manage people remains a challenge for me. The great thing is that I get to hire a team. And so sometimes you need a PhD and a PhD person, and sometimes you don't. And sometimes do you not only not need a PhD, but having a PhD is gonna run counter to what you need done. Yeah. You know what I mean? So that's building a good team, I think, is a skill set that we build over time. I'm getting better at it. It's not as easy as it sounds, and no one can do it alone. So I don't claim individual credit for this. I got a great team, and always looking to make it better. You know, maybe not necessarily bigger, but like we're always working together to figure out how to work with each other well. But also our job is to work in the Gulf. So we are gone a lot. We are working with all kinds of state governments, NGOs, academic institutions, even community-based organizations. And so we really have this nice network, which is fun, but it can be a little unwieldy because there's a lot of moving parts involved.
Yeah. Well, you talked about the depressed areas that are adjacent to the Gulf, but what about your work with Africa? You've worked, you focus on the environment and these challenges in Africa, and I would think that would be a great place to learn because their disasters, the people there are so much more vulnerable to any kind of disaster. So the work that the scientists do is even more important there. Tell us a little bit about your work in Africa and how has that influenced your work in the Gulf?
I loved working in Africa. I loved it. It was the best work I've done. It was the hardest work I've done. It was the most fulfilling work that I've done. And so the idea of that work was to work with scientific organizations across Africa to build their scientific capacity. That was it. So we were working with we were helping to build and work with other academies of sciences across Africa to build their capacity to be able to apply, translate, and inform policy with science. And so that was the idea there. And when I started, we had like 9 academies, 9 countries we were working in. By the time I finished it, there was 15. And now I was just in Rwanda last week. It was just in Rwanda. Wow. And now there are 41 academies of science in Africa. And when I was, and it's just really rewarding. So that work was great. I mean, I came into that project as a hydrologist, right? I'm a hydrologist. And in Senegal, there was this effort of making sure the water sciences were combined with the health sciences because in Africa, the under 5 mortality from diarrhea is a scandal. There is no reason a child should die of diarrhea, and yet that rate in Africa is super duper high. So those are waterborne diseases. So having a hydrologist there was seen as helpful. And I just remember thinking, oh, I'm not a water chemist. I don't talk about water quality. I'm a physical engineering hydrologist, right? Which is like how water moves, quantity, and that kind of thing. And everyone was looking at me like I was crazy. They're like, are you gonna help us or not? I'm like, oh, okay. You know what I mean? So working in Africa was great. I mean, one, the need is great. That's number one. 2, the potential is through the roof, which is why China, Russia are also in Africa. The potential is enormous. And number 3, the talent is really high and the talent is super motivated. So when you're there and you're working with smart, motivated people who have to figure it out sometimes under really constrained conditions, it's really uplifting. I mean, like it is, I always leave there just on cloud nine. It is true. Like they're the happiest, you see these global indices of happiest people on earth, and they're in Nigeria or they're in Jamaica or they're Haiti or something. And you're just like, how can that be? And it is true. And it's just great. So the Africa work is still really near and dear to me. When I was in Rwanda, it's just, if you can believe this, the biggest drone operation in the world is out of Muhanga, Rwanda. The biggest drone operation in the world is in Mahanga, Rwanda. Like, get your head around that. Like, not in the United States. It's a US company, but the operations are there. And this drone operation is running all medicines, blood, platelets, plasma for the whole country. 25 minutes from needing a call to dropping it at the hospital by drone. It's amazing. So like there's all this hope and promise. And you know, I think that for the scientific capacity, what we're going to see in probably all of the global South, but I don't work in Southeast Asia or South America too much. We're going to see them leapfrog, you know, like they kind of skipped over the landline for phones. They leapfrogged over that. Like, we're not doing landline. They went from no phones or radio communication to wireless cell phone. So what's the next leapfrog going to be? We'll see, but it's coming. It's really fascinating.
And when you work with the scientists in Africa, are there a lot of women? In America, we think of scientists as being dominated by males, definitely dominated by white males, but probably a lot of foreigners as well. Not necessarily African-American females. And that's why you're such a leader and a role model. But what about in Africa? Do we have a lot of women who are in scientific roles? Are you dealing with mostly men?
Mostly men.
Yeah.
Without question, mostly men. It depending on the country, you'll see women and young women, you know, students age women in the sciences. And just like in the United States, there's often a break. You might get women in undergraduate programs, but then there's a big drop off for women in postgraduate programs. That's repeated in Africa. What I find so uplifting on this question is when I'm working with scientists in Africa and when there is like a woman in leadership, those are pretty rare people, but man, those women, they are fiery, they are fired up, they are so energized to get as many, to right all the wrongs. I mean, like these, and they're like 60s and 70s or even older. They've been through it, they were treated badly, and they're just like, I am here to get you all through the next thing. And it's like, I'm like, I want to be like you. So many of the cultures in Africa are male dominated. You know what I mean? There's just kind of no getting around that, but the doors are not closed. And slowly, I think those doors are opening and letting, and inviting women to walk through. But that's more of a global thing. I mean, even in the United States, the number of women in PhD programs is way smaller than men, even though the undergraduate levels are almost equal.
Yeah. How about you? Who was the first female role model that inspired you, be it African-American or not? Who was your first like Hidden Figures? I think I got the movie right. Who was your first scientist that made you think, you know what, this is something I could pursue?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, because one woman I met after I finished undergrad and I went to work, Black woman, amazing role model. She was a lawyer, not a scientist. I don't know. I have been really helped and aided by men. I have a lot of role models, and I remember this, the man who became my PhD advisor up at Harvard. So the program that I got into at Harvard accepted one person a year. And it was this advanced study program, and you got to put together your own program. So I was picking from ecology and geology and hydrology. So that's like natural sciences, physical science, and engineering. It was this mishmash. And they only admitted one person a year, right? And so I was talking to this professor who ended up being my advisor, Richard Foreman. I was just like, no one gets into this program. You know what I mean? And I wasn't like graduated, summa cum anything from UVA, double engineering, right? So I was like, what do you think? And he said, I think someone has to get in. It might as well be you. And when you hear something like that, it doesn't matter what the person looks like who says that. Like that sticks, because that's life right there. Like we're watching the Olympics. You know what I mean? Like these are remarkable people, but someone has to win. Might as well be. You know what I mean? So I just, that's a really good question. But I will say that I'm inspired by all kinds of people, even today. And many of the people who touch me the most are little kids, actually. I see these little kids, like I was in Rwanda, like I said, it's fresh on my mind. And I met this 11-year-old, and she was at the drone facility, and she was asking me like why I was there. And I was telling her that, understanding the business and the aerodynamics, I was an engineer. And she was like, so do you know how the drones fly? And I said, I do. And she said, I want to know how a drone flies. And she was 11. I was like, you're going to go and figure out how a drone flies. And then you're going to bring this drone to fly further. Like, you know what I mean? So the little kids really get me. When I'm in the Gulf, we have this program. Like we give out a lot of funds, or a lot of grants and things. And I was there in New Orleans one day, and a professor comes up to me, and he was thanking me for the support of the program. Just by the virtue of my position, I don't actually get involved in the actual granting. I don't do that because it's too close, right? So I said, okay. And he said, well, the grant was to bring high school kids into doing environmental science research. I said, that's great. He said, I want you to meet my students. I said, okay. There were 7 Black high school boys. And I almost started crying. I was like, our program did that. Wow. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. Black high school boys were planting trees and looking at the difference of heat in their neighborhoods for the places that had trees and the places that didn't have trees. They were doing field empirical data collection on the water quality coming into their houses and leaving their houses. They were doing, all these things that we just talked about at the beginning of this, saline and water quality and land loss. Like these kids were measuring it in their neighborhood. And so in the same way that I love the Africa work, because it was about building their capacity to generate and dictate their own research agenda, these kids were like, this is where I live. These are important. And I was so overcome. And then just kind of following those kids, I helped 2 of them write their college essays, you know what I mean? Because they wanted to go into science. And I was like, you want to talk about being inspired, like those kids inspired me.
Yeah. When you tell the story about the little girl in Africa, I'm reminded of the story of I think it's Mark Baltabon, who wrote the book Kaffir Boy, the first time he saw Arthur Ashe in South Africa in 1975, and how it affected his life, because he had never seen a Black man able to play tennis with the white guys in South Africa. I did want to ask you, I know I joked earlier about Rochester not being the most diverse area in the world, but I did want to ask you, what did you make of UVA when you first got there? I came from Northern Virginia, and my high school was 4% Black, but it was a very, for the time, progressive area. So going to UVA was like going back. It felt like a segregated Southern town to me. But what about you? What was the transition from you going from the Rochester area to Charlottesville?
I found my people at UVA. Like where I grew up, being like a middle class Black family was an endangered species too. You know what I mean? So Rochester, New York is not all white. You know what I mean? But Pittsburgh, just outside of it, was. And so, we got all of the weird stuff of like, can I touch your hair? And can Black people get tan? And You're pretty for a Black girl. Like we got all of that. You know what I mean? I got all of that. And when I got to UVA, I found so many people like me. You know what I mean? And that was just like, oh, wow. I don't have to explain. I don't have to, it was great. So what I found strange though at UVA, being from the North, was that everyone called him Mr. Jefferson. It took me a while to realize they weren't talking about an actual person walking around, because everywhere else was like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. Like we gave them their full names. And then there was, when I got to UVA in 1987, there was a Klan march in Stanton. I don't know if you remember that. But I remember calling my parents, like, there's a Klan march over the hill, My dad from Brooklyn, very practical, was like, yeah, well, don't go to that. But it's like, there was always something kind of simmering racially under the surface at UVA. But I didn't really engage in that simmering, because I was really enjoying the friends I was making and the experience of like being a Black girl doing her thing like everybody else at school. And it was a big enough school that while it's, at the time, remember, it was 10%. Now it's like down to 4 or 5, 6%. It's really low. That's still like, thousands of people walking around like me and you. So it was great, like to meet people like you and, all of the friends that we have. So I thought it was great. Going back for my master's though, I found it much smaller. Like I did find that, like undergrad was great, came up to DC, worked for a few years, went back for my master's, and that's when it felt small. I was like, this is a small place with some pretty backwards, you know what I mean? Like then I was very sensitive to like the county versus the city and so when Charlottesville erupted in 2020 or whenever, you know what I mean? I wasn't surprised at all.
Yeah, it was always there. It was always there. UVA felt like a Black school to me, because like we found our people, and you get used to, you'd walk down the street and you'd only see Black faces. And it was really interesting to me because I never had that experience at home. But it must have been a little unique to you to be a Black woman, a double major in the E school. So that had, it was you and Trevor, and I'm trying to think of all the engineers that I know. But
Mike Perry, Marlon Smith,
yeah,
right?
Marlon was an engineer. I forgot. So what was the experience like in the E school for a Black student?
It was probably not that different. It was just much smaller. The numbers were much, much smaller. But Mike Gaines, Tom Lynch, I mean, like all these, we were in it together. Marlon and Mike were like our big brothers, helping us through. I mean, there was a real community. It was just small. It was tight though. And we helped each other. There was no reason to be segregated in the E school. I mean, it's a small place to start with. But it was just like everything else on a smaller scale, except for that class-wise, we never really had to go to the BBS because our classes weren't over there. You know what I mean? So, I mean, that was actually a thing, of course, but the fact that we were so over with chemistry and Thornton Hall and math, like that was not over by the BBS. And so if we wanted that hangout time, you had to build that in.
It's interesting, my son's down there now, and because they put a plaque up at the BBS, it's no longer cool to actually hang there, because once you commemorate something, it's like, oh God, it's part of it. Also with Mr. Jefferson, they don't talk about it. We had to kind of endure that and kind of like, all right, that's who built this place. They don't even have to do that these days. I don't even think, I mean, obviously Monticello is still there, but I think it's a little bit different. And one thing I find really interesting is UVA is now, I believe, majority minority. Obviously that's
Is that
Asian
right?
and all over the world. So it is.
So it's majority non-white.
I'm sorry, majority non-white. Yeah. Yeah, majority non-white. So it is diverse in a very different way. But there's the numbers of African Americans are, I think, as you said, pretty small. I wanted to ask you about going to Harvard. Now, um, I would think that would be a little intimidating. It's not that you weren't prepared for it, but we kind of put Harvard on this pedestal, and I think we imagine everyone there must be the brightest person in the world, and it's just going to be brutal to be there. Does a UVA student, does it take a while to get your confidence that I belong at Harvard? I went to the university. I mean, what is the transition when you go to Harvard?
Harvard's a pressure cooker. You know what I mean? It's a pressure cooker, and the level of competitiveness is higher than I've experienced. It is palpable. It really is palpable. In the sense of like, depending on your department, and depending on your immediate context, you might have an idea for your well, let me put it this way. I'm a person who kind of thinks out loud, right? If I have an idea, bounce it off a lot. I'm thinking of it as I hear myself say it. And in a place like that, that really can work against you because people will criticize an unbaked idea, right? They might label you as incompetent if your idea isn't smart enough. And then when you're not looking, they'll take it as their own. So all of those things can happen at the high levels of PhD education anywhere. So it's a really competitive place. And yes, I had imposter syndrome. And then I realized that a lot of people have imposter syndrome. And that's kind of the one thing that binds everybody. Like once you make a few friends, you might say, are we really the right people? And everyone's thinking that because, you know what I mean? So I think that Harvard College, the undergrads, they have a very different experience than at least the scholastic PhDs. And I know that the law school and the business school, everyone has their own culture and experience. I guess the thing that I took from Harvard, and it's a saying that I was told by one of my advisors, and it was like two professors were fighting, and I was not in the middle. You know what I mean? But they were both my professors, and they were fighting with each other, and publicly. It was really ugly. And another guy said to me, he's like, you know what, Lauren? When elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled. And of all of the things that I learned at Harvard, how to model, all kinds of stuff that I learned scholastically, dealing with people was probably the thing that I value the most from there. When you're dealing with really high level, smart, difficult people who aren't always nice, if you can manage that, bring it on. You know what I mean? So now, all of that said, Harvard's a great place to be from. It really is. It's great. And I still go back. I give lectures every so often. It's really nice to go back. It's really nice to be from. I'm very proud that I have that credential. And it's just not an easy environment.
Yeah. Well, Lauren, I met you at a UVA alumni event, and we have a vibrant Black alumni community at UVA.
Yeah.
What is your relationship with Harvard? I know you go back and you teach. I know you had to deal with kind of the tension being a PhD student at Harvard. But what about today? What is your relationship with your fellow alums? Is it like it is with UVA? Do you still have that close relationship, or is it more of it's your ticket to the front of the line at the club? I mean, I went to Harvard. You need to get out of my way.
Well, I don't think that would be a club I'd want to get into anyway. But but a couple of things. So when I was in graduate school, unlike UVA that has RAs that are undergrads living in the dorms, at Harvard, it's the graduate students that are RAs.
Mhm.
And that was a great experience because it gave me a community that was outside of the work I was doing and really much more a part of what the culture of the university is. And it was great. And those people I'm still friends with, you know, and so but the alumni structure at Harvard for people in the college, like my husband went to Harvard and they have a very tight, you know, Hogwarts kind of setup. So so they're set up really well. Their alumni structures are very different than for the graduate school. And but I still have my friends and it's always nice to go back to a place that's familiar to you. So in some ways it feels like home, and some ways it's like, you know, that was a really important piece. I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I can go back and touch the stone and then come back to my people here in the DMV.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Laura, this has been great. You've always been such an easy person to talk to. You're so humble for someone who has accomplished so much. But you know, we're very young people. We have a lot of work to do. But when you think about retirement, well, this is the last question. What are some of the things you'd like to accomplish when you don't have to work every day? I would think you have so many abilities, so many things you could do. You could probably teach at a certain level. But what are some of the things that you want to do in retirement to either give back or things that you can explore and challenge yourself with?
That's a great question. I don't know if I'll retire. You know what I mean? It's like the work that has to get done for me is like from the neck up. And as all the joints and stuff start to, you know, do things that we are sad to see them do, hopefully if I can, from the neck up, if I'm good, I can contribute. So the first thing I wouldn't do is manage people. Would not do that. But I would always be happy to consult, and I don't mean like as a consultant, but like you know, be conferred for people to come and ask me advice of how to do things, because I've done a lot of different things in a lot of different places. I think I still have a lot to contribute, but I would want to get to spend time with my husband. We're both really busy, and so that would be nice to do that. I'd like to spend time. We have a place down on the Chesapeake Bay, and I like to kayak and spend time in the water. As a hydrologist, that shouldn't surprise anybody. And I'd like to get to the point that I can travel first class around the world without having to worry about whether my miles will upgrade me.
I haven't thought about that. Well, that's great. Well, look, Lauren, I know you promised me an hour, and we're getting to the hour mark, but it was great catching up. This is the only way I can ever see you is to invite you on my podcast. So I might have to think of some more topics.
We can change that, Julian. We can go back to having lunch. I would love that.
That'd be great. Yeah. Well, look, you guys are an inspiration. Give my regards to Senator Augustine, and you know, just keep doing what you're doing. Every time I read about you guys, you always are such positive role models for all of us. So, you know, just keep doing what you're doing. I look forward, you know, to keeping doing a better job of keeping in touch.
Julian, thank you for having me. This has been great seeing you and your big smile. This is a great way to start this day. So thanks for sharing that with me and including me in this awesome podcast. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. This has been great. I really enjoyed it. So
me too.
Yeah. Well, have a great day and let's keep in touch.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye, Lauren.